As you notice, I got the throttle cable hooked back up. Got the vacuum line that goes from the brake booster up to the intake. It's hooked back up. You got a vacuum line here that goes down to the EGR solenoid. That one's hooked back up. And then off the EGR solenoid comes up around to the EGR. I got that one hooked back up. This line here comes around down to the fuel pressure regulator. You want to make sure that's in good shape and hooked back up if you unhooked it. However, that one can stay attached if you remove everything in one piece like I demonstrated. If you come down here, I got the heater hose hooked back up. There's a bracket that goes down to the bell bolt. Upper radiator hose back on and tight. This is best to do prior to installing the coil pack. It's much easier to access. You can see what you're doing. So that's a good tip. Right down here you have a vacuum hose that goes to the bottom of your throttle body. That's for your evaporation. That comes down here. And if you have problems with any of these routings, guys, if you forget where they went, I could give you a schematic of the vacuum hose round. However, on this hood goes to your EGR solenoid. This red one goes to the intake, so you can look at this fuel pressure regulator. If you ever second guess yourself, pull out a vacuum diagram and make sure you have everything 100%. I don't think I covered this in the last video clips when I was removing the head, but I just want to give you a shot of this main harness. This is where I unplugged it from the intake. I was able to leave the whole harness hooked up to the injectors and the, all the sensors involved. So it saves a lot of time. Just pop them 2 plugs. Before I plug that back in, I'm going to reinstall the fuel lines. I took and I put some petroleum jelly, Vaseline, on the O-rings. Since it is holding back a petroleum product, I figured why not? It should be fine. So I'm just going to take and pop them in. Just like so. Same thing here, just like so. Always take and reinstall your safety clips just in case. I'll just take and I'll plug this harness in. Just like so. Just so we don't forget, I just wanted to mention you do have a wire that goes down to your crank sensor. You see that index mark on that cam? I'm not sure if I'm going to get you to see it, but there's a dot on the cylinder head and you got to line up them 2 index marks. Right there's that dot on the inside. Hopefully you can see it. I'm pretty sure I got a good shot there. Okay. And then down on the crank, I'm not sure if you can see it. Man, everything started rusting just in one day. It's amazing. There's another index mark on that crank. Not sure if you can see it right there. And that has to line up with that other notch. Okay, hopefully that's a better shot. You see the 2 index marks? You got the one on the crank, and then you got the one on the aluminum housing. As you can see, I'm off a little bit to the left, so I'll turn that a little bit to the right. You'll know if you're off one tooth either way because it'll be pretty severe one way or the other, one tooth. So we'll take and we'll line that up a little better. One more thing. I got the new tensioner installed. That's this piece right here. As you can see, no more noise. Prior to tightening up the center bolt on that idler, there's a spring. You'll see when you get your new tensioner, there's a spring inside that aluminum housing. Leave that bolt loose. Take a pry bar, put it between this stud, it doesn't take much, and push on it as far as you can, and then tighten up this retainer bolt. What that does is it'll leave slack in your timing belt and allow you to reinstall it with ease. And one of the main reasons why I want to take and reinstall the timing belt right now prior to installing anything is simply because once I start putting your lifters in, the rocker assemblies and everything else that's involved, that's when you start compressing the springs, correct? So prior to compressing the springs, we want to make sure we're up on number 1, top dead center. As long as that mark down there is lined up, you know you're on number 1, top dead center, because that mark is hooked up to the same crank as your number 1 piston is at, so it's going to be in the same location as that journal, correct? So as long as we're there, we know our number 1 piston's up. As long as our mark is here, we know we're on number 1 with the cam, and our valves are going to be relaxed, because you don't want these valves compressed with the piston up, because this is an interference engine. So that's one thing you want to avoid, otherwise you're going to bend your valves and you're going to have to start all over. What you want to avoid is putting the timing belt back together and turning that crank 360 degrees, because then your cam's going to be 180 out. The reason this is because they call these cog pulleys. If you take notice, the bottom crank cog is about half the size of your cam cog. So what happens is, when you turn that crank 360 degrees, your cam is 180 out. For ease of access, I took and I jacked the engine back up with the block of wood and jack underneath the oil pan and removed the motor mount. Okay, so now with the timing belt reinstalled, as you can see, everything, all of our marks are lined up. You would know if you were 1 tooth off, because your index marks will be off a tooth. So with this lined up, I took and I loosened the tensioner retaining bolt. There's a spring inside that tensioner, and now it's pushing pressure against the inside of this timing belt. What we want to do now, and you can do this with everything installed on the top end, I'm going to take and I'm going to turn the engine over by the crank 2 full revolutions. I'm doing this by the book, and what this will do is, as I turn the crank clockwise, it's going to be pulling down on this side of the belt, making it tight, putting all the slack on our tensioner side. You do not want to turn it counterclockwise, because otherwise it's going to put the slack on the wrong side of the belt and it will skip on you. Just got to temporarily reinstall the harmonic balancer. Okay, that's 1. Trying to keep it close because you don't want to turn it backwards. So that's 2. Our index marks are still lined up. And now remember, the reason why you want to rotate it 2 times is because if you just go 1 time, your timing marks aren't going to line up. They're going to be 180 out of each other. So if you go 2 full revolutions, hence the different sizes in the pulleys, your timing marks will line back up for you, and you can double check them. So now that we put all of our tension on the inside of the belt, I can take and tighten and torque the tensioner retaining bolt to specs. One more thing I like to add, in my case, I didn't have to turn this engine 2 revolutions because my cam was just idling. I didn't have my lifters and rockers installed, which would be putting a load on that cam. However, I just want to show you the correct way to do it if you still had your valve train all together. Okay, I got the timing belt tensioner all tightened and torqued. You want to resist the temptation of prying against the backside of this tensioner and putting more pressure than what the tensioner applies to the belt, because you'll end up with a whine, and it can be very annoying for customers, and it'll be coming back to you to correct it. So let the tensioner do its job. That's why it's good practice to replace it when you do the timing belt. It's also a good practice to replace the water pump while you're here. Let's face it, you got everything apart already. The water pump runs off the timing belt. You know, you just got 2 hoses, a few retaining bolts, and you can pop a new water pump on it. However, I replaced this water pump on the last timing belt service, so we're going to let it go this time, and on the next service I'll replace the water pump. Okay, now we can start putting the valve train back together. I got most of the lifters in, as you can see. I left one out to demonstrate. This is a roller cam, so it does have roller lifters, and if you look at the bottom, the roller is must go in the direction of the cam. So there's a notch on the top side, and if this was just in this bore, I could just take and spin this in all directions, and you don't want your roller to be sideways, so you want to have it facing the same direction in the cam. Next, we're reinstalling the lifter retainers. Pretty much what these do is prevent these lifters from spinning, because like I mentioned, they're roller lifters. You don't want that roller to be the wrong way, so these prevent them from spinning inside the bore. As you can see, they're notched, and so are the lifters as well, with corresponding. And they simply sit on there just like so. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but if you notice, I have assembly lube on all the lifters. They won't fall in place unless they're installed correctly. One quick thing I took notice to, you see how these retainers have this little bent tab? It seems to face towards the front of the engine, towards the timing belt. If I put it the other way, they don't sit down in because they hit a tab. They hit that tab. So you gotta face that way. Just like so. Okay, the next thing we were installing is these spring clips. They hold down on those retainers, just like so. When you tighten on the rocker arms, they keep pressure retained down on top. What I noticed on these is that you have this notch. You can't go this way, otherwise it doesn't line up right, and plus the notch hits. So it's pretty much self-explanatory. It's got to go in that direction, so those tabs face towards the back side, away from the timing belt. Okay, as you can see, I got the rocker arms mostly reinstalled. These pretty much get tightened right down. The main thing here is that you gotta make sure your timing marks are aligned, because at this point, if they're not aligned and you go cranking these down, you can bend valves. This is an interference engine, so I can't stress that enough. However, as you can see, I laid these out in order when I took them off, if you remember. And you got your long side and your shorter side, pretty much with all your retainer clips reinstalled. Pretty much put that in there like so. Got a notch in the bottom that goes into the corresponding notch in the cylinder head, and you're going to tighten them down and torque them to 22 foot-pounds. At this time, it's a good practice to take and reinstall your harmonic balancer temporarily and give this 2 revolutions. Once again, check your timing marks. If you feel any binding, stop right away. Loosen up all your rockers, double check your timing marks. Because like I mentioned before, guys, this is an interference engine, and this is the step that will cause the damage. Okay, here we go. One. Coming up on 2. 2. Okay, to prevent any unnecessary trash from entering the engine any more than we have to, I took and I reinstalled the valve cover. It's all tightened, torque to specs. I do still have the spark plugs removed. Wouldn't be a bad idea to temporarily reinstall them as well. Okay, I just reinstalled the timing cover. Pretty simple, just slide it down into place, slide it over your studs. If you did tweak one out of shape, you're gonna notice it now. But get it to pop together and reinstall your fasteners. I did come over here and install that retaining bolt into the head, so I can put the alternator back in place and all these brackets as well. Okay, I took and reinstalled the harmonic balancer. Came up here, reinstalled the alternator, lower retaining bolt, upper retaining bolt, tighten them down tight, reinstalled the tensioner, then I reinstalled the serpentine belt. I found it easier just to leave this off for now while I was reinstalling that tensioner and belt. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but you gotta remove a retaining bolt from this power steering line to give you some room to freely access this retaining bolt for the tensioner. Got the alternator back in place, all the retaining bolts all wired up, plugged in, ready to go. Reinstalled the coil pack, 4 retainers, put them in, tighten them up. Other than that, I installed the PCV valve, hooked it up to the intake. Thing I forgot to mention earlier, I reinstalled the dipstick. It just slides down into the crankcase and then pops into its retaining bracket. Alright, where did I leave off with you guys? I got the exhaust hooked back up. Everything's buttoned up down below. Got the drain plug in and tight. Reinstalled the lower hose, got that tight. Oxygen sensors plugged in. I'll tidy up on the wire harness and stuff after we know everything's good. I'll get some zip ties out and make it look nice and neat. Same thing with any of the connectors that have broken plugs. I'll use some zip tie method to keep them plugged in tight, because these things get brittle over the years. And as you can see, I had a zip tie technique once before. I can show you how I do that later on. Man, we're getting really close, guys. I just topped it off with oil. Okay, I put a new oil filter in. I topped the oil filter off as well. Got the battery hooked back up. You will notice that I intentionally left the coil pack unplugged, so I don't want to have any spark at this moment. I also left the fuel injection fuse out like we had prior. Alright, the reason I left the coil pack unplugged and the fuel injection fuse out and the spark plugs removed is because I want to crank this over with the starter and have very little restriction on the engine. That way I can try to get some oil pressure built up and get it throughout the engine. So time to crank it over a little bit. Well guys, during my troubleshooting I disconnected the starter wire and I jumped the solenoid with the screwdriver because I was working on this by myself. There you go, I forgot to plug it back in. Sure did. Okay, we're plugged back in now. I should be able to crank it. Okay, it's time to install the spark plugs. I'll be using brand new Autolight Platinums, 5144s. Okay, it's moment of truth. Just gave everything a once over, made sure the oil's good, antifreeze is topped off, firing order's correct, coil pack's plugged back in. Just got to reinstall the fuse, fuel injection. I'm ready to crank it. Here we go. Sounds pretty good, guys. I don't hear any tapping, so the lifter's pumped right up when I was cranking it. That's a good sign. You're going to see some smoke in here shortly. I accidentally dumped a little antifreeze. I just want to let it get up to operating temperature, let the fan kick on, let everything break in, you know, before I go driving it. Sounds good. That's what I like. Temperature's getting up there. That airbag light was on before. We're idling somewhere around 850, 900. Yeah, we're still keeping an eye on it. Starting to get warmer. Coolant fan should be kicking on shortly. Yeah, about halfway. Hey, you want to go for a ride? Let's do it to it. Like I say, these old Escorts really had some pep to them. Just got back from a 2-hour drive. Got my son along. You ready to go for another ride, bud?
I hate these seatbelts.
Gotta love these Escorts. It's been running great, guys. And we'll be on our way. So you enjoying the ride, bud?
Yep.
Hope everybody enjoyed. Stay tuned.